James Bennett wiped the sweat from his brow, his muscles burning from hours of hauling hay under the relentless Texas sun. He wasn't used to this hard labor, dirt under his fingernails, the scent of horses and fresh-cut grass clinging to his skin. But that was the point. No one here knew that James was a millionaire. No one suspected that he usually wore tailored suits instead of worn-out jeans. And no one, especially not the rancher's daughter, Savannah Blake, had any idea that he had come here for reasons far beyond just needing a job. The moment he saw her, he knew he was in trouble. Savannah stood by the fence, her long, golden-brown hair swept into a loose ponytail, a streak of dirt across her cheek. She was arguing with one of the other ranch hands, her hands on her hips, her brown eyes flashing with fire. "You can't just leave the gate open like that, Travis. If my dad's prize stallion gets loose again, it's on your head," James smirked, watching the way she commanded the space around her. She was tough, no doubt about it, but there was something else beneath that fire, something softer, something she probably didn't let many people see. And for some reason he wanted to be the one to see it. Savannah turned and caught him staring. She narrowed her eyes. "You, new guy," James straightened, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Yeah, you know how to fix a fence," he shrugged. He'd never fixed a fence in his life, but how hard could it be? "Sure." She tossed a pair of worn gloves at him. "Great. You're coming with me." James followed her without hesitation, trying to ignore the way his pulse kicked up when she walked beside him. She smelled like wildflowers and sunshine, a scent so different from the designer perfumes he was used to. "You got a name, or should I just call you new guy?" she asked, glancing at him. "James." He hesitated for a fraction of a second before adding, "James Bennett." She nodded as if she were filing that information away. "Well, James Bennett, let's see if you're more useful than the last guy my dad hired." They worked side by side in the heat, Savannah showing him how to hammer the boards into place. James was slower than her, less sure of his hands, but he learned quickly. "So, what's your story?" she asked after a while, pausing to wipe her forehead with the back of her hand. "You don't look like a ranch hand." James's heart pounded. If she knew the truth that he was the owner of Bennett Enterprises, that he had more money in his bank account than this ranch would probably ever see, she'd never treat him the same. So he lied. "Just needed a change," he said, keeping his voice casual. "Wanted to get away from the city for a while." Savannah studied him for a long moment, as if trying to decide if he was being honest. Then she nodded. "Fair enough." They finished fixing the fence just as the sun started to set, casting everything in a golden glow. James leaned against the post, watching Savannah as she stretched her arms over her head, her shirt lifting just enough to reveal a sliver of tanned skin. He should leave. He should remind himself that this was temporary, that once his reasons for being here were fulfilled, he'd be gone. But when Savannah turned to him, a small, unexpected smile tugging at her lips, James knew with absolute certainty he was already in way too deep. James threw himself into the work, determined to prove he wasn't just another guy passing through. The ranch had a rhythm of its own, a steady pulse of early mornings, long hours, and exhaustion that seeped into his bones. But he welcomed it. Savannah, however, wasn't making it easy on him. She had a way of testing people, watching for weakness, for signs they wouldn't last. James could feel her eyes on him whenever they worked together, silently measuring his worth. One afternoon, he was tending to the horses when she appeared at the stable doors, arms crossed. Her gaze flicked over him, assessing. "Think you can handle breaking in a Mustang?" she asked. James leaned against the stall, wiping sweat from his brow. "You don't think I can?" she smirked. "I don't know yet, but I guess we'll find out." The Mustang in question was a fiery chestnut named Bandit, all muscle and spirit. The moment James stepped into the round pen, the horse pawed at the ground, nostrils flaring. Savannah climbed onto the fence, watching. "If you get thrown, try not to land on your face." James laughed under his breath. "Good advice." He moved slow, careful, his hands steady as he approached. He wasn't an expert, but he'd grown up riding. He knew this was about trust more than strength. Bandit snorted, shifting uneasily before James pressed a hand to his neck. A long moment passed, then the horse stilled beneath his touch. Savannah's expression flickered, something like approval crossing her face before she masked it. "Not bad," she admitted. "For a city boy," James arched a brow, "you calling me soft." She tilted her head, pretending to consider. "I guess we'll see how you do tomorrow." With that, she hopped down and walked away, leaving James staring after her. The next morning, James was saddling up Bandit when Savannah tossed him a rope. "We're moving cattle today," she said. "Think you can keep up?" He caught the rope easily, grinning. "You're really enjoying testing me, aren't you?" She didn't deny it. The cattle drive was no joke. It was hot, dusty, and relentless. James kept pace beside Savannah, their horses moving in sync as they guided the herd. At one point, a young calf broke away, bolting toward the tree line. Savannah cursed. "Go after it." James didn't hesitate. He pressed his heels into Bandit's sides, surging forward. Dust kicked up around them as he closed the distance, the rope coiling in his hands. One throw and the loop landed perfectly around the calf's neck. He reined Bandit in, bringing the calf to a stop just as Savannah rode up. Her eyes shone with something like surprise. "Not bad," she said, a little breathless. James smirked. That almost sounded like a compliment. She shook her head, but he caught the smile she tried to hide. That evening, the ranch hands gathered around a bonfire, the air thick with the scent of burning wood and grilled meat. Someone played a guitar, laughter mixing with the crackling flames. Savannah sat on a log, stretching out her legs. James took the spot beside her, handing her a bottle of water. She accepted it without a word, taking a sip before glancing at him. "All right, James Bennett, you're not useless," he chuckled. "High praise." She studied him, something unreadable in her expression. "You don't talk about yourself much." James's grip tightened around his bottle. "Not much to tell," she arched a brow. "Everyone's got a story." He could feel the weight of the truth pressing against him. But if he told her if she knew who he really was, everything would change, so he just said, "Maybe I'll tell you one day." Savannah held his gaze for a long moment before looking away. Maybe. And for the first time since he arrived, James realized something dangerous. He didn't just want to prove himself anymore. He wanted her to see him. The days bled into nights, each one pulling James deeper into a life he never expected to crave. The steady rhythm of the ranch, the exhaustion that came from honest labor, the quiet satisfaction of a job well done, it all felt real in a way the boardrooms and luxury penthouses never had. But none of it compared to Savannah. She challenged him at every turn, pushing him harder, expecting more, and never letting him forget that he was still just the new guy. Yet beneath her sharp wit and unshakable confidence, James could see glimpses of something else, a quiet loneliness, a weight she carried that had nothing to do with the ranch. One evening, as the last light of the sunset faded into a deep purple sky, James found her leaning against the barn, staring out over the fields. He hesitated before walking toward her, boots crunching against the dry dirt. She didn't look at him, but she didn't move away either. "Long day?" he asked, keeping his voice light. Savannah exhaled slowly. "They all are." Something in her tone made him pause. It wasn't exhaustion, it was something deeper. A weariness that had nothing to do with physical labor. "You ever think about leaving?" James asked. She turned to him then, her brown eyes sharp with something unreadable. "And go where?" he shrugged, leaning against the barn beside her. "Anywhere." "Somewhere new." For a moment she didn't answer. Then she sighed. "This ranch is everything to my dad. It's been in our family for generations. If I leave, who's going to keep it running?" James studied her in the fading light. "What do you want?" Savannah let out a soft, humorless laugh. "Want doesn't matter much out here. You do what needs to be done." The words hit him harder than he expected. He knew all about obligation, about carrying the weight of expectations. But he also knew what it felt like to want someone so badly it became impossible to ignore. And right now, standing next to Savannah, he felt that pull stronger than ever. Before he could say anything, a voice called out from the house. Her father. Savannah pushed off the barn. "I should go." She hesitated for half a second, then walked away, leaving James staring after her, wondering if she felt it too. The next morning, the storm rolled in fast. Thick clouds swallowed the sky, turning everything a dull gray. The first crack of thunder sent the cattle into a restless shuffle, and within minutes, the downpour started. James was in the middle of securing the horses when Savannah came rushing toward him, rain dripping from the brim of her hat. One of the fences broke in the back pasture. "We need to fix it before the herd gets loose," she said, breathless. They saddled up and rode out into the storm, rain soaking through their clothes, mud splattering across their boots. The wind howled, making it almost impossible to hear anything else. But Savannah pressed forward without hesitation, her determination unwavering. By the time they reached the broken fence, the ground had turned into a mess of slick mud and deep puddles. Savannah jumped down first, grabbing the wooden planks. James followed, the storm swallowing them whole. They worked in silence, fighting against the wind and rain. Every movement felt heavier, the cold sinking into his bones, but he pushed through. At one point, Savannah slipped in the mud. James caught her before she could hit the ground, his arms instinctively wrapping around her. For a second, neither of them moved. The storm raged around them, but all James could hear was the sound of her breath, the pounding of his own heart. She looked up at him, rain dripping from her lashes. There was something raw in her expression, something unguarded. He could kiss her. Right here, right now, with the storm raging and the world narrowing down to just the two of them. But then she pulled away, stepping back as if realizing how close they had been. "We should finish this," she said, her voice quieter than before. James nodded, but the moment lingered between them, charged and impossible to ignore. By the time they made it back to the house, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. They were both soaked, exhausted, and covered in mud. Savannah hesitated at the porch steps, glancing at him over her shoulder. "Thanks for helping back there." James met her gaze, something unspoken passing between them. "Anytime," he said. She nodded once, then disappeared inside. James ran a hand through his wet hair, exhaling slowly. He was in trouble, because this wasn't just about proving himself anymore. This was about her. The days after the storm passed in a blur of routine, but something had shifted. James could feel it in the way Savannah's gaze lingered on him a little longer when she thought he wasn't looking. In the way her voice softened, just slightly, when they spoke. He told himself it was nothing, that the moment in the rain had been just that, a fleeting moment, but the truth clung to him like the scent of fresh hay and sun-warmed earth. He wanted her. Not just the fire in her eyes or the way she challenged him at every turn. He wanted the quiet parts of her too, the parts she kept locked away as if she didn't trust anyone to see them. And that terrified him, because he wasn't supposed to stay. James had come to this ranch for a reason that had nothing to do with Savannah Blake. But when she walked toward him one evening, the last light of the sun painting gold across her skin, all of that faded into the background. She stopped just a few feet away, her hands buried in the pockets of her jeans. "You're leaving soon, aren't you?" James stiffened. He should have expected the question. He'd known it was coming, had told himself it didn't matter, that she didn't care enough to ask. But now, standing in front of her, the words felt heavier than he expected. He swallowed, forcing his voice to stay even. "I was never meant to stay forever." Savannah nodded slowly, as if she'd already known the answer. Still, something flickered in her eyes, something he couldn't quite name. She looked away, exhaling through her nose. Makes sense. The air between them stretched tight, charged with something unsaid. James took a step closer, his voice quieter now. Savannah, she shook her head, cutting him off before he could finish. You don't have to explain anything, James. You came here to do a job, and when it's done, you'll leave. That's how it works. He searched her face, trying to find cracks in the armor she always wore so well. Is that what you want? A muscle in her jaw tightened. Does it matter? Yes. The word came out before he could stop it, raw and unguarded. And Savannah must have heard it too, because she finally met his gaze again, her brown eyes searching his. For the first time since they met, James didn't know what to say. So he did the only thing that made sense. He closed the distance between them, his hand lifting to brush a stray strand of hair from her face. She didn't move away, didn't push him back. And then, before he could second-guess it, he kissed her. The moment their lips met, everything else disappeared. The ranch, the lies, the reasons he wasn't supposed to fall for her, it all faded into nothing. Savannah's hands gripped the front of his shirt, pulling him closer as she kissed him back, her body pressed against his. James felt like he was drowning, like he was tumbling headfirst into something he wasn't sure he could survive. And he didn't care. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Savannah searched his face. You're still leaving. James's chest ached. He hated that she was right. Hated that he couldn't give her the answer she deserved. But then something inside him shifted. He could stay. Because what was the point of all the money, all the success, if it meant walking away from the only thing that had ever made him feel real? James exhaled, his forehead resting against hers. Not anymore. Savannah pulled back just enough to look at him, confusion flickering across her face. What? I was here for a reason. James took a breath, steeling himself. I didn't come to this ranch by accident, Savannah. I came looking for something, for someone. Her brows furrowed. What are you talking about? James hesitated, but he couldn't keep the truth from her any longer. I'm not just a ranch hand. Savannah blinked, her expression unreadable. Yeah, I figured that much. He huffed a quiet laugh, shaking his head. I own Bennett Enterprises. The silence that followed was deafening. Savannah just stared at him, as if waiting for him to say it was a joke. When he didn't, something in her shifted. You're serious. James nodded once. I didn't want to lie to you. But I needed to see this place for myself, see you. Savannah crossed her arms, her posture guarded. Why? He took a step closer. Because your father saved my grandfather's ranch once. A long time ago, before I was even born, he gave him a loan when no one else would. My grandfather never forgot that. James swallowed. And when I found out that your family was struggling to keep this place running, I wanted to help. Savannah stared at him, her expression unreadable. So what? This was all just some business trip for you? No, James's voice was firm. It was never just business. Not after I met you. She studied him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether to believe him. Then, finally, she sighed. So what happens now? James reached for her hand, lacing their fingers together. That depends. Savannah arched a brow. On what? On whether you'll let me stay. She hesitated, her gaze searching his. Then, slowly, a small smile tugged at her lips. Guess you'll have to prove you're not just another city boy playing cowboy. James grinned, relief flooding through him. I think I've got a pretty good reason to try. And as Savannah pulled him in for another kiss, James knew without a doubt he wasn't leaving. Not now, not ever. James had thought winning Savannah over would be the hard part. He'd thought that once she knew the truth, once he made it clear, he wasn't just going to disappear, everything would fall into place. He was wrong. Savannah didn't make things easy. She didn't let him off the hook just because he had money or good intentions. She wanted proof that he wasn't just playing cowboy, proof that his promises weren't empty. And James, he was willing to give her that proof, no matter how long it took. The next morning, instead of heading back to the main house like he usually did, James went straight to the stables. He saddled up Bandit before the sun had fully risen, the sky still streaked with early morning pinks and purples. Savannah was already outside, working near the barn, her sleeves rolled up as she stacked fresh bales of hay. She glanced up when she saw him, her expression unreadable. James didn't wait for her to speak. He climbed into the saddle and rode out toward the back pasture, pushing Bandit into a steady gallop. If she wanted him to prove himself, he would by working harder, by staying longer, by showing her that he wasn't just another man passing through. By the time she made her way over, James had already mended the loose fence post and checked on the cattle grazing nearby. He wiped the sweat from his brow, turning just as she approached. She studied his work for a long moment, then crossed her arms. "So you're really sticking around?" James met her gaze, unwavering. "Yeah, I am." Savannah didn't look away, didn't back down. But then, after a long silence, she gave a small nod. Not approval, not yet, but something close. They fell into an unspoken routine after that. James worked alongside her from dawn until dusk, never asking for special treatment. He repaired what needed fixing, rode out with her when she checked the herd, and even helped with the stubborn old tractor that always seemed one breakdown away from falling apart completely. And slowly, something shifted between them. One evening, after a long day of work, James sat on the wooden fence, watching the last of the sunlight fade. Savannah stood next to him, arms resting on the top rail, her eyes fixed on the horizon. For once, the silence between them wasn't filled with challenge or tension. It was something softer. James turned toward her, his voice quiet. "You ever think about what comes next?" Savannah exhaled, her fingers tapping against the wood. "For the ranch, for you." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she picked up a small stone from the ground, rolling it between her fingers. "I used to," she admitted finally. "Before things got complicated. Before I realized that the ranch was more than just home, it was responsibility." James understood that feeling all too well. Savannah glanced at him then, her expression unreadable. "And you, what happens when you don't have to prove anything anymore?" James didn't hesitate. "I stay." Savannah looked at him for a long moment, her brown eyes searching his. Then, without a word, she tossed the stone aside and started walking back toward the house. But James didn't miss the way her steps were just a little slower than before, as if she wasn't quite ready to leave him behind. The next few weeks passed in a blur. James made good on his word, throwing himself into the work as if he'd been born into it. Savannah still challenged him, but the edges of her resistance softened. One afternoon, as they rode out to check on a section of the property, something shifted. Savannah turned to him, the wind catching the loose strands of her hair, and for the first time there was no hesitation in her voice. "You're different than I thought you'd be." James arched a brow. "Yeah, and what did you think I'd be?" She smirked, shaking her head. "Some rich guy playing cowboy. Someone who'd get bored as soon as things got hard." He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping. "And now?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached over and took his hand, her fingers threading through his just enough to make his heart pound. "Now," she said, "I think maybe you belong here more than you realize." James tightened his grip on her hand, knowing that whatever came next, whatever challenges they still had to face, he wasn't going anywhere. Not as long as she'd have him. James had never been one to second-guess himself. His entire life had been built on decisions made with confidence, calculated risk, and unshakable resolve. But standing in the middle of the ranch, watching Savannah work with the horses, he realized something unsettling: he wasn't in control anymore. Not of his feelings. Not of whatever was happening between them, and for the first time in his life, he didn't care. He had spent weeks proving himself to her, throwing himself into the work, refusing to let his wealth or past define him here. And now, finally, he could see it in her eyes. She believed him. She trusted him, but trust wasn't the same as forever, and James wanted forever. That night, as the sky stretched wide with stars, James found Savannah sitting on the wooden porch swing, a mug of coffee cradled in her hands. The air was cool, carrying the scent of freshly cut grass and the lingering warmth of the sun-baked earth. He took a seat beside her, the swing creaking slightly under his weight. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet between them had shifted over the last few days, no longer filled with unspoken challenges or stubborn resistance. It was something else now, something softer. James rested his elbows on his knees, gazing out over the darkened fields. "I've been thinking." Savannah sipped her coffee, her expression unreadable. "That sounds dangerous," he chuckled but didn't let her deflect. "I don't want to leave." She went still, fingers tightening slightly around her mug. "You already told me that, I know. But I need you to understand, I don't just mean the ranch, I mean here, with you." Savannah set her mug down on the small table beside her, turning to face him fully. "James." "I know you don't trust easy," he interrupted gently. "I know you've had to fight to keep this place running, to prove yourself to everyone who thought you couldn't handle it. I know you don't let people in because you don't want to risk losing them." He reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "But I'm not going anywhere." She studied him in the dim light, her brown eyes searching his face as if trying to find cracks in his promise. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she exhaled softly. "You really mean it, don't you?" James squeezed her hand. "With everything I have." She let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. "You're insane, you know that?" "Probably," he grinned. "But I think you like that about me." Savannah rolled her eyes, but there was no denying the way her lips curved into a smile. And then, without another word, she leaned in and kissed him. It wasn't like their first kiss, filled with hesitation and uncertainty. This one was different. It was a promise, a silent agreement that neither of them had to speak aloud. When she pulled back, her voice was soft. "If you're serious about staying, I won't stop you." James brushed his thumb over her knuckles. "Good. Because I already made up my mind." Savannah sighed, shaking her head as if she couldn't believe him. "You really are impossible," he smirked. "And yet you're still here." She rolled her eyes again but didn't let go of his hand. "Yeah," she admitted, "I am." And in that moment, James knew he had finally found the place he belonged. Not just on the ranch, not just in this life, but with her, forever.